Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Houston Baptist University's second lecture for the A.O. Collins lecture series for 2021. It's hosted by Houston Baptist University and our seminary, Houston Theological Seminary. I'm pleased to welcome once again David Moffitt, who will be speaking on the incarnation and the direction of sacrifice. So thanks again, Dr. Moffitt, for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to you, and you'll dazzle us with the direction of sacrifice. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks, Paul. I'm not sure how dazzling it'll be. I'm going to develop a bit further a few points I either made or implied or alluded to last night. But I want especially to focus on the fact that sacrifice moves in a particular direction. An important aspect of Jewish sacrifice, sometimes missed by modern scholars, is its directionality. There's movement inherent in giving a gift to God. The gift, that is conveyed into God's presence. Specifically, one offers a gift to God by bringing it to his house and having his servants, the priests, take it to his altars and thereby bring it into his presence. In the context of covenant worship, where the sacred space that serves as God's earthly house has been set up and is functioning, that is where you have the temple, sacrifices offered to God naturally moved from the offerers who were outside of God's house into God's house so that God could receive and accept the gift. Sacrifices, that is, ultimately move into the presence of God. Roy Gain puts this point well when he states, quote, "In Hebrew, the idea of sacrifice in general is conveyed by the noun korban. The meaning of korban is associated with that of the hifil verb from the same root, harav, literally to cause to come near, which can refer not only to preliminary conveyance of offering material to the ritual location, but also to the formal ritual presentation to the Lord. This formal presentation transfers something to the holy God for his utilization. So a korban, a sacrifice or a sacrificial offering, makes something holy by giving it over to the holy domain of God," unquote. Gain focuses on Leviticus, but there are numerous other texts that make this point. In Deuteronomy 12:11, for example, and if you have a handout, this is the first text there. Moses avers, quote, "Then you shall bring everything that I command you to the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. Your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and your gifts, and all your choice votive offerings that you vow to the Lord," unquote. Sacrifice involves bringing a gift to God by bringing it to the place that he has chosen. And this is the place where he has allowed his house to be built. The gift is, therefore, brought to the temple in order to convey that item into God's presence. At its heart, Jewish sacrifice is about this movement, the conveyance of a gift into the presence of God. Indeed, an essential part of what makes the gift holy or sacred consists in this movement that goes from the mundane world into the holy presence of God. A gift becomes a sacrifice, from the Latin verb sacar, to make holy, by moving into God's house and therefore into his presence. We can consider just a few other examples of this dynamic. In Jeremiah 17:26, the second text on the handout, God speaks through the prophet and promises that if his people will keep his Sabbaths, Jerusalem will remain inhabited, and the sacrifices will be able to be brought, quote, into his house, unquote. Septuagint renders this as eis oikon kuriou, into the house of the Lord. Moreover, the facts that the priests must have a greater degree of ritual purity than the average person, and the fact that the high priest must have a greater degree of ritual purity than the average priest, correlate directly with the relative access and proximity that each one of these people has to God's presence. The average person can, the average Jewish person at least, can enter the courtyard of God's house, but go no further. The priests can approach the altars and they can enter the holy place in the house of God, but they can go no further. The high priest, and only the high priest, can enter the inner room of God's house, the Holy of Holies. So there's a correspondence between one's level of purity, the level of purity required of you, and your ability to approach God's presence as you come near to him. A number of other biblical and extra-biblical texts and concepts could be cited and discussed, but suffice it to say that this fundamental point, that sacrifice involves the gift moving from outside God's house into his house, and thus into his presence, correlates with another important conclusion. I touched on this a bit last night for me at least. A sacrifice is not reducible to any one act, but involves an entire process whereby a gift being given to God moves from the mundane realm into his holy presence. The verb sacrifice denotes a sequence of acts that involve an offerer and priests doing certain things as they draw near to God in order to transfer a gift to him by bringing it into his house. Part of what makes the gift holy, part of what makes the gift a sacrifice, something sacred, is its conveyance from the mundane realm into God's holy house and presence. So sacrifice involves a process, conveying the gift from an offerer to the holy God. This movement does not occur by way of a singular act, such as killing an animal. Killing an animal does not make it holy. It occurs by a series of activities as the offerer gives the gift to the priests, and then the priests take the parts of the gift to the altars. Those activities performed exclusively by the priests at and upon the altars are the most significant and effectual acts in the entire process. These are the primary places and ways that the gift is transferred into God's presence. That these are the most effectual aspects of the process is particularly clear in those cases where the process achieves the benefits of purification and forgiveness, which we can refer to as sacrificial atonement. In most cases of atoning sacrifices, these benefits are most closely associated with the priestly activities at the altar, as the various summarizing statements that show up at the end of descriptions for the sin offerings in Leviticus 4 make clear. If you look at text 3 on your handout, you'll see just one of these texts. But after describing the process of sacrifice, and in particular after describing the priest applying blood to the altar and burning the fatty parts, then you get a statement summarizing everything saying atonement has been made and forgiveness is offered to the offerer. The application of blood to the altars and the burning of the choice parts are therefore the weightiest and most effective aspects of the process. In addition to this, Deuteronomy 12:27, text 4 on your handout, singles out blood and flesh as the very elements that are offered on the altar as sacrifice. Bringing blood and flesh to the altar stands at the center of the process. This all makes good sense, since these priestly acts convey the gift into God's presence, where he can accept it. The preceding points further imply that a gift is fully transferred to the Lord when a priest takes those various parts of the gift to the altar. By manipulating the blood and burning part of the gift, in some cases nearly all of the gift for a burnt offering, by burning that part of the animal or also grain, and in some cases pouring out wine, the gift is conveyed into God's presence. The goals of the process, both in terms of giving the gift and in terms of any benefit that the act confers upon the worshiper, are attained if God condescends to accept the gift. I think that's an important point. We sometimes imagine that sacrifice is just doing a series of things in the right way. But actually, the whole thing hangs on God's willingness to accept the gift. The priests, by performing the ritual appropriately, are given authority to judge that the goals, for example, atonement, have actually been attained. Now, some significant implications follow from these observations. If sacrifice entails multiple acts, some of which are more effectual and central than others, then isolating any one act from the others, or performing only one act from the series, does not constitute a sacrifice. Thus, for example, if one simply killed an animal, even if you took an animal to the temple and killed it there, but did not take any of its parts or its blood to the appropriate altars, no sacrifice has occurred because the gift has not been conveyed properly into the presence of God. Slaughtering an animal does not make a sacrifice. It should be clear, too, that using the verb to sacrifice in English in relation to Jewish sacrifices, as if that verb were coterminous with the act of slaughtering an animal, a way that I think many of us tend to use the language of sacrifice, typically mistakes and misrepresents the meaning of the verb. Slaughtering an animal does not convey its body and blood into God's presence. Someone has to take the body and blood to the altar after the slaughter has occurred in order for the gift to be conveyed into God's presence. By the same token, the gift is given wholly over to God, even when only parts of the gift are actually burned or used by a priest at an altar. When one sacrifices an animal to God, one cannot simply give some of the animal's blood to God. Neither can you cut off and burn only some part of a sheep, say its fatty tail, returning the rest of the gift to the offer to continue to own and use. Giving the gift is costly, not least because the entire animal, and especially all of its blood, belong entirely to God. The blood of the animal, which is the element of the sacrifice identified with its life, must be entirely drained and used entirely at the altars. Thus, none of the blood can be given to anyone other than God. This may be part of the rationale for the prohibition on eating blood. To eat blood would be effectively to steal some of what belongs to God. In this way, all the life of any animal sacrifice is always entirely given over to God. Only when all the gift has first been given to God, by at least part of it being conveyed into his presence by way of being burned on the outer altar, and by way of all of its life being poured out at the altar, can some of the gift then be used in certain cases by those who participated in the sacrifice. So in certain cases, the priests are allowed to take parts of the animal. The priests typically get the skin of the animal, for example. In certain cases, the priests are required to eat parts of the animal. And in certain cases, in the case of the peace offering, the offerers themselves can eat the animal. But all of this only happens after the parts have been burned and all of the blood has been given at the altar. So when sacrifice involves an animal, slaughtering the animal and draining all of its blood so that all the blood itself and all the appropriate parts of the gift can first be given to God at the outer altar are necessary elements for the sacrifice. Apart from these elements of the larger process working together, the gift has not been fully given to God, and no sacrifice has occurred. But how then does this relate to Jesus, and especially to his incarnation and his sacrifice? I think at least 4 points can be made. First, the preceding discussion allows us to correlate Jesus' death with an important element of sacrifice, while also cautioning us against reducing all of Jesus' sacrifice only to his death. The slaughter of the animal forms a necessary and constituent element in the larger process, but the slaughter is distinct from the offering of the animal on the altar. On the Day of Atonement, in particular, the slaughter is self-evidently distinct from the high priest's entrance into the inner sanctum to offer the blood obtained from the animals to God. From this perspective, one can speak about a sacrificial slaughter. You can talk about a sacrificial death without in any way implying that the slaughter or death is the sum total or content of the sacrifice. In keeping with the larger notion of sacrifice as a process, the incarnate Son of God first died. And this death can be understood to be sacrificial, can be part of the whole process. Second, however, these points suggest that this kind of death, a sacrificial death, or especially the death of Jesus, can only be seen to be sacrificial, at least in Jewish sacrificial terms, if in fact the rest of the process is carried out, so that the gift is actually conveyed into God's presence. Just here, I suggest early Christian claims about Jesus' resurrection and ascension into the heavenly Holy of Holies to offer himself to God, such as we find very explicitly in the Epistle to the Hebrews, but also more implicitly, and you can see this on text 5 on the handout, in 1 John 2, 1 through 2, which we looked at yesterday, and a text like Acts 5:31, and possibly a text like Romans 34. These texts make very good sense if we view them as the culminating part of a larger process. And it's precisely in the ascension and the ascended Jesus that one could then look backwards, as it were. I mentioned this briefly yesterday, and recognize that the death of Jesus was part of the whole sacrifice. If all you have is the death of Jesus without conveying the sacrifice into the presence of God, you have no sacrifice. These early Christians were not saying then that Jesus' death was the sum total of his sacrifice, at least that's what I'm arguing, any more than that they would have imagined that the slaughter of the victim at the temple was the sum total of that sacrifice. Rather, in the light of their confession of Jesus' ascension, they could then correlate his death with one element in the larger process of his sacrifice. Third, texts such as 1 John 2, 1 through 2, or Acts 5:31, again, text 5 on your handout. Let me just say, if those of you who don't have a handout, Acts 5:31 speaks of God exalting Jesus to his right hand in order to give repentance and forgiveness of sins to Israel. The exaltation happened to bring the possibility of repentance and forgiveness of sins, according to Acts 5:31. So in the third point then, in texts such as that, or again in Hebrews, with its emphasis on Jesus' offering of himself to the Father in the heavenly Holy of Holies, that is, in texts that focus our attention on the ascended Jesus doing or achieving something that makes atonement possible, such texts cohere well with what Jewish and biblically informed followers of Jesus could have been expected to mean when they spoke about his sacrifice. This point is particularly clear given the direction of the process of Jewish sacrifice that we just explored above. If sacrifice culminates not in the slaughter or death of the victim, but in the priest delivering the gift to God, then it's precisely the items being offered to him by conveying them into his presence that would have been a focal point. The altars are especially those places where the blood and parts of the slaughtered animals, at least on the outer altar, were given over to God. All of this suggests that when we see New Testament texts correlating Jesus' ascended state with his ability to bring forgiveness to his people, we're seeing these early Christians tracing precisely the right direction of movement for the incarnate Son of God, relative to the direction that sacrifices at the temple actually moved in. That is, the incarnate Son goes into God's presence to present his sacrifice. A fourth and final point needs to be explicitly stated here. There is a curious and often unnoticed problem with modern notions that insist that Jesus' sacrifice consisted solely of his self-offering at his death on the cross. If we take the incarnation of the pre-existent Son of God seriously, such that the Son left the Father in some way in order to take up human blood and flesh on earth, then we need to note that accounts of Jesus' death on the cross that assume that this event is the sum total of his sacrifice are assuming that the Son moves in precisely the wrong direction relative to the Father in order to offer himself as a sacrifice to the Father. If Jesus offers his sacrifice to God on earth, he offers himself away from God's heavenly presence. If we think in particular of the Day of Atonement again, the high priests draw near to God's presence by going into the inner sanctum of God's house in order to offer there the annual blood sacrifice to God. Many modern accounts of Jesus' sacrifice, however, posit that the Son left the Father's presence in order to offer himself by dying on the cross, only to then suggest that the Son rose and ascended back to the Father after having offered the Father his sacrifice. This understanding of the incarnational narrative about the Son is exceedingly strange from the perspective of Jewish sacrifice that we explored above. Are we to imagine that early Christians, by and large, were claiming that the eternal Word left the Father's presence to take up human blood and flesh in order to offer that blood and flesh by dying on earth away from the Father's presence, only to then return to the Father's presence after having offered his sacrifice? From the standpoint of the biblical accounts of Jewish sacrifice, such a conception of Jesus' sacrifice seems to me to be confused and frankly nonsensical. It is very difficult to understand in either historical or theological terms how Jesus' early Jewish followers would have initially developed traditions that so radically redefined or perhaps even misunderstood their own sacrificial traditions, particularly as they reflected on the traditions of Jesus' bodily resurrection and ascension back to the Father. More plausible, I think, is an account of Jesus' sacrifice that correlates his sacrificial offering with his return to the Father. If we think of Jesus' sacrifice in incarnational terms, the sending and the return of the Son to the Father correlate well with the direction of Jewish sacrifice. We can see, that is, how the actual incarnational narrative that texts such as 1 John, but also John's Gospel, and Luke Acts, and Hebrews, and Revelation, and several passages in Paul. We can see how these texts align with the direction of Jewish sacrifice. The Son leaves the presence of the Father where he is slain, and then returns to the presence of the Father as the high priest who offers the sacrifice. It makes far more sense, I think, to envision the Son's return to God's heavenly presence as the time when and the place where he, as the incarnate high priest, offers himself as a sacrifice to God. Put differently, analogies between Jesus' incarnate sacrifice and the actual practice of Jewish sacrifice, particularly analogies with the Day of Atonement, seem to emerge naturally when we take seriously the structure and pattern laid out by the direction of Jewish sacrifice and think about that together with the incarnational narrative we've been talking about. On the other hand, and in conclusion, it is, I think, exceedingly difficult to see how these analogies between Jewish sacrifice and the incarnational pattern do not collapse into mere metaphor used to explain the spiritual significance of Jesus' death, if we continue to imagine that the cross really is the sum total of Jesus' sacrifice. On that sort of account, robust notions of Jesus' bodily resurrection and ascension simply become unnecessary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moffitt. This was a huge privilege for us at Houston Baptist University to be able to have you here, host you here for these lectures. Well, you're in Scotland, but to Zoom you in, we learned a lot. You gave us tons to think about, and we're really grateful for your time and energy that you put into these lectures. So please join me in thanking Dr. Moffitt one more time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.